Hi everyone. This is the first video lecture of week 10 and we're just wrapping up before the spring break. So this week we will be done with the Bronze Age, so we're simply looking at the very end of the Bronze Age this week. We're covering the time period known as the Late Bronze Age, which is the last 400 years of the Bronze Age in Western Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean. In this time period, we're going to be looking at something more closely to the Eastern Mediterranean as opposed to Mesopotamia that we have been focusing on. Because the real cool things that are happening during the Late Bronze Age is really largely around the Mediterranean Sea. And in this first lecture, I'm hoping to set the stage for that. So if you look at this map of the East Mediterranean and Western Asia, we can see this interesting network forming all the way from Aegean to the Indus Valley to South Asia. And what we see here is an increasingly connected network of sea routes, but supplemented with trade with land, overland routes or river transport. That connect this entire realm. And you can see that Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys, really play a key role in connecting the Eastern Mediterranean world to the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea and eventually South Asia. And we will see that these routes will play a major role all the way, really, to the Roman period, especially it really flourishes also during the Roman Empire. But also, I'd like to sort of really take your attention the role that Egypt also plays in this entire network. And in the Late Bronze Age, actually, Egypt appears as a major political force and empire, so to speak. And so with the development of seafaring technologies during the Bronze Age, particularly in the second half of the second millennium BCE, we see a very strong seafaring maritime trade and exchange network, but also diplomatic connections in the Mediterranean, which becomes the Eastern Mediterranean sort of really all the way from Italy to the Levantine Coast in the east, becomes an incredibly vibrant space of trade and exchange, then supported with a lot of mining, urbanization, and prosperity that comes with all of these. And islands such as the island of Crete in the Aegean, the island of Cyprus, south of Turkey, plays an important role in the formation of this network. So this is the world that actually gave birth to a number of empires that are in competition with each other at this time, and I'm going to talk about them in a little bit. So let's look at what we're really studying this week. The first and foremost, we're looking at this kind of art, trade, and connectivity in the Mediterranean world, and sort of really looking at the Mediterranean like the French historian Fernand Braudel has done. Has opened the way in looking at the long-term history of the Mediterranean. When we look at the ancient Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age, between 1600 and 1200 BCE, we see traders, entrepreneurs, and kind of seafaring sort of uh, becoming very powerful. And in this lecture, we're going to really look at that in this way. So Aegean, Egypt, the Levantine Coast, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia were then connected with both this kind of entrepreneurial trade network as well as diplomatic relationships. And we will study the famous Uluburun Shipwreck that actually has told so much, has told us so much about understanding the seafaring network. In the second lecture, I'm going to turn to art. What is understood as international style that emerges out of this network. So, and the themes there are hybridity, diplomacy, and the kind of mixing of cultures because of this very engaged, intimate links that are formed in the late Bronze Age. We see a lot of connectivity and movement, and of course, this somehow has an important implication for the formation of art styles which become hybridized, mixed together a lot more fluidly. And so the distinctions between different regions are kind of became less clear, and the relationships, overlaps, shared cultures become more emphasized. So that's something that we're going to discuss in the second lecture. And in the third lecture, I'd like to sort of really go to Anatolia, really for the first time in this class, and because in the late Bronze Age, we see for the first time in a kind of a political unification, a political sort of unification of various components on the Anatolian Peninsula, coming together, and we're going to look at the Hittite Empire and its architecture of rock and water monuments, specifically a very peculiar, a very interesting sort of dynasty which links itself to Mesopotamia, but still very distinctive in its own local traditions, religion, religious practice, and state celebrations. And we're going to look at some of that in the third lecture. So let me start with this question of what is an empire. I mentioned that this is an important moment in Western Asian history that some prominent empires rise, and so we want to sort of really try to define and engage with the concept of empire, what it is. Basically, an empire is usually defined in the context, in such contexts as an empire, a kingdom, a monarchy with territorial ambitions. Territoriality is key here, and one that establishes its ideology of the state based on conquest and an unending desire to conquer and appropriate landscapes, territories, local cultures, and so on. So this vital definition then therefore leads to an understanding of empire where administration of territories of heterogeneity, these heterogeneous territories, have to be administered and linked together. And these are composed of different language groups, religious and cultural practices somehow have to be linked together within the kind of central imperial ideology of the state, and we'll see how that really, in the third lecture particularly, we're going to see how that was happening in Anatolia under the Hittite Empire. One interesting thing that happens is the differentiation of the imperial core and the borderlands. And so, for example, the Assyrian kings continuously talked about land of Ashur as their kind of really homeland, and under the protection of god Ashur. And they contrasted that with what they referred to as the yoke of Ashur, that implies the subjected communities on the edges of the empire that they constantly sort of really interacted, either by taxing, making them subject to their imperial rule, or conquering them, or even sometimes destroying them. So these you could see, sometimes you see them as kind of really enslaved communities. Capital cities of these empires have a major role in the political configuration of the land, and the administration of those territories. Actually, empires usually move and control territories by establishing new political centers of governance. And so construction of new cities, for example, become a very important practice for them. We will see some examples of this in this week, in the coming weeks. And one of the important roles these cities play is a ceremonial and ritual role, where multiple festivals are celebrated. And this is used as an ideology of unification of the state. And we see this very clearly in late Bronze Age Egypt, in New Kingdom Egypt, and in Anatolia under the Hittite Empire, and they're very comparable. We'll look at some of that this week. So the city, therefore, acts as a public space, while its architectural surfaces in those urban spaces are turned into narrative documents, into spaces of writing history. So with posted texts and carved images, and this becomes a very important thing, particularly in the Iron Age. We're going to study this idea, how urban spaces, architectonic surfaces are then transformed into spaces of history writing, particularly by means of commemorative monuments. So this kind of writing of history and shaping of politics through the inscription of the spaces of the city is a common practice that is shared by these polities. And a really good example of this is the emergence of the imperial palace as a commemorative monument. And we're going to see this very powerfully both in Assyrian and Babylonian empires in the Iron Age, very particularly. It becomes some kind of a stand-in for a map of the cosmos, in the way that all those conquered territories, those accomplishments, are then kind of really displayed verbally and pictorially on the walls of a palace. And it becomes this really visually rich narrative, kind of a geography, standing in for the geography, the conquered geography, the geography of power of the empire. So then if we actually look at these empires, just a really quick overview, kind of ahead of time for you, what are these empires that we're going to look at in the coming weeks. The first one is the Hittite Empire, which I will talk about in the third lecture this week. Sort of really unifying a kind of a really interesting dense network of both mining and particularly copper and silver, and also the trade. There's a dense urban network in Anatolia, which then gets combined and sort of unified with the by the Hittite administration. And the second one is the Assyrian Empire, that is based in northern Iraq, but expanded east and west, both into Iran and into Anatolia and Syria. particularly during the sort of late second and early first millennia BCE. The third one is the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and these are empires that we're going to study after the spring break, and interestingly based in Babylon, but having reached all the way to the controlling the Levantine Coast, Israel-Palestine. But it's pretty short-lived. And finally, we will, at the end of class, in the final weeks, we're going to study the Persian Empire, which probably has the largest expansion of territories connecting Central Asia all the way to Greece. And so it's really pretty stunning. So this time period that we're covering in the second and early first millennium BCE, I'd like to give a kind of a chronological sort of framework for you to work with, and we'll come back to these dates again, just for us to reimagine, to kind of really remind ourselves where we are. We talked about the 2000 BCE collapse of states in Mesopotamia. You read about it in Lauren Risvet's book, in Memory, the section on memory. And this, from here, from 2000 to 1600, the time period we refer to in Mesopotamia as the Old Babylonian period, or the Middle Bronze Age. This is the time when we have the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. That's where that's contemporaneous, and that comes to a sort of an end around 642. Two important historical events there that impact a major change, and that is around 1642. There is an eruption of a major volcano in the island of Thera, Santorini. This eruption is so large that it impacts the entire eastern Mediterranean. There is actually ash that is found on archaeological levels in Anatolia in Turkey, which seems to have, and this is also like really marks the transition really from Minoan to Mycenaean sort of really cultures. These kind of really transition from Middle Bronze Age to Late Bronze Age. And another sort of important historical event there is the Hittite sack of Babylon around 1595. That's also taken as really the end of the Middle Bronze Age. And the time period between 1600 and 1200, what we're pursuing this week, is the Late Bronze Age. And this is a time of the new kingdom in Egypt, when Egypt really rises to become an imperial power. This is a time when Hittite Empire in central Anatolia rises to become an empire. And this is also the moment when the Middle Assyrian kingdom, sort of originating in northern Iraq, also slowly transforms itself into a kind of an imperial power. And then we have another collapse, but this one is probably the largest and most talked about collapse. And we're going to talk about it after the spring break again, because I feel that this is a very important event for the entire history of Asia, Western Asia in antiquity. And this actually is interpreted in various ways, either with climate change or with a kind of an economic collapse of the Late Bronze Age trade network that I was talking about, because we see a major abandonment of the urban centers, the collapse of the Hittite Empire, and Egypt is in very difficult state, and they talk about the arrival of sea peoples that are sort of looting Egyptian cities, and so it's a time of trouble. And that's actually considered to be the transition, the ending point of the Bronze Age and the transition to Iron Age. And so in all of our sessions after the spring break, we're going to be exploring that Iron Age, starting the week after the spring break. So, so if we look at then this network, going back to this network of empires and internationalism, then is the most prosperous time between 1600 and 1200 BCE. And this wealth was tied to a maritime trade network, as I mentioned, of merchant ships traveling across the Mediterranean and doing trade at wealthy coastal cities and ports of trade, dropping off different kinds of goods and products and buying new ones, and then kind of really moving on. It's still, although this shipbuilding technology has advanced to produce true sea-going ships, these ships are still doing navigation, the coastal navigation, going along the coast and stopping at various ports. And because of the currents within the Mediterranean, historians reconstruct a counterclockwise, you can see that green arrow around the eastern Mediterranean, a counterclockwise route for these ships visiting Mediterranean harbors. So going from the island of Crete to Egypt, as you can see, to going around the Levantine coast, getting to Anatolian coast, which is a little treacherous with lots of pirates, and then getting back to the Aegean and having another network, and another branch of that, of course, extends into the Black Sea as well. So, but how do we know this? We know this in two ways because of particularly two major bodies of evidence that I'd like to share with you. One is the Uluburun Shipwreck, which is a ship that sank in at the end of the 14th century BCE, which is a very crucial moment within the late Bronze Age, with its cargo on it, and we're going to study the cargo of this ship. And then the second one is a tablet archive that was discovered in the Egyptian city site of Tel el Amarna, known as the Amarna Letters, which includes diplomatic correspondences between the major territorial powers in Western Asia at the time. So if you look at this, the first one is, of course, the Amarna Letters. Just very briefly, these are a set of diplomatic correspondences, letters basically between various kings of the Western Asian empires. They refer to each other as brothers, and these letters are kind of really sent back and forth between them. They refer to each other as brothers. The Hittite Great King, the Egyptian Pharaoh, the Mitannian King, the Babylonian King, the Canaanite king at Ugarit, and the king of Elishia, Cyprus, and the Assyrian king. And there are some certain interesting hierarchies between them. This is a very important archive for this time period, because from here we understand this constant communication between these different kings. We figure out from the tone of the letters, we understand there's a certain level of hierarchy among them. For example, I think the Assyrian king refers to the Hittite king as my brother, and then the Hittite king sends back a very harsh letter saying, "Who are you? You're not really recognizing your own status. You're not at this stage of calling me a brother." And so there is this kind of really interesting political, sort of hierarchical set of relationships that are going on. From these letters, we learn we learn very much that these kings are also sending each other diplomatic gifts along with the letter. So it would be very rude just to send the letter, but you have to include some kind of precious item. We don't exactly know what those gifts look like. We're going to discuss some examples as possible options in a little bit, but this is important to know. There are diplomatic intermarriages between different dynastic leaders, which is really quite important way that these leaders are actually, these dynasties are connected to each other, sometimes by blood. It's really quite interesting. There is a constant political contest between these great powers over land resources, in terms of like cutting timbers, mining, and sort of their power, particularly on these craft and production and trade centers in Syria, seems to be in hot debate. There's actually a war between Hittites and the Egyptians that take place at the city of Kadesh in Syria, which then results in some kind of an agreement at the end. But that's really quite important. So, but the second set is an archaeological evidence that I'd like to share with you, and I'll wrap up my lecture today with this. This is the Uluburun Shipwreck, which was found excavated off the coast in southwestern Turkey near the modern town of Kaş, in a right off from a promontory called the Uluburun. And this is and the ship, from its cargo and its wood, it was dated to the late 14th century BCE, smack in the middle of this kind of really hot, very active, very vibrant seafaring trade that's happening in the Mediterranean. It sank with its full cargo. On top left, you're actually seeing a nice reconstruction of how it looked like. And so and it was excavated by the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, based at College Station, Texas, at the Texas A&M University, between 1984 and 1994, in 11 seasons. And of course, this is done by scuba diving and under 150 feet below sea level, and required about 22,000 dives, individual dives into the ship. And you see the find location in the bottom left. There's a little ship in the center below photograph. There's a little boat, white boat. That's actually where the ship sank there. Its main cargo was actually these bulk products of metals and various kinds of raw materials, especially a large cargo of copper ingots from Cyprus that was being transported, and tin ingots also, I think, from Iran. And so copper was acquired most definitely from the island of Cyprus. That was the most common, most important source of copper at that time. And copper was circulated. In order to make bronze, you need copper and tin. It's an alloy of copper and tin in a ratio of 10:1. So a lot of copper, a little bit of tin is what you need in these kind of bronze working workshops. And so these copper was circulated in the form of these ingots. And so you can see a huge stack of them in the ship's cargo. In addition, the archaeologists also found other forms of raw materials like these glass ingots, or the hippo incisors and canines, which were supposed to be used, and also some elephant ivory, always used also to be used as carved into objects in ivory. Oftentimes for furniture, small objects, the handle of a knife or something like that. Additionally, apart from that, the ship also carried a substantial cargo of foodstuffs and in Canaanite jars full of olives, olive oil, wine, and fish sauce, apparently. They had a number of large jars filled with Cypriot pottery, some Mycenaean pottery, and a set of elegant swords that were Near Eastern, acquired in the Canaanite workshops, most likely somewhere around Ugarit. And finally, some prestige and cultic items were included that are possibly intended for specific individuals, luxury items. This bronze figurine on the left with gold-clad head, hands, and feet, and is particularly significant, a very sort of really important one, and archaeologists have suggested that it may have really been the protective deity of the ship itself. Archaeologists also found a gold pendant that depicts a nude female deity, frontally depicted, known from the Syro-Mesopotamian world, but has some of these Egyptian features. And on the right, a gold pectoral depicting a falcon with outstretched wings. All of these items have hybrid stylistic and iconographic features due to the highly international context of the ship. Such hybridity and mixing that we see here in all of these objects among the visual cultures of Egypt, the Aegean, Near East, Anatolia, the Levant, is really the hallmark of this time period. And I finally want to share with you and draw your attention to this really rare artifact, a wooden wax tablet. It's a wooden tablet which would be covered with wax, and you would take sort of really daily notes on it and erase and take more notes, do calculations, and so on. So we're imagining that this belonged to either the ship captain or maybe some merchant who was on the ship. Preservation of wood is really rare, and we're thankful to the underwater context. The wax is gone, of course, but one can imagine this serving a very important daily function for the ship. So this wraps this lecture up with this map, which is, if you look at the map, you can see the location of the Uluburun Shipwreck once again. And also what is mapped on here are the little artifacts that are actually found on the ship. So you can see how spread it is from all the way from those ivory pieces from Nubia, the Sudan, to tin in Iran, tin in Anatolia, Mycenaean jars in Greece, and various pottery from Crete and Cyprus. Also the copper ingots from Cyprus, glass ingots from Egypt, Upper Egypt, and so on. And you can see how sort of really well connected this ship was, and it's probably somewhere in its journey around the Mediterranean. So this is the end of the first video lecture. In the second one, we will turn to how this connectivity, how this trade and exchange really impacted the style and iconography of the arts in this time period. So thank you.